The Ultramarines are considered one of the strongest and most honored of all the Space Marine chapters in the Imperium of Man, and were responsible for almost single-handedly holding the Imperium together after the Horus Heresy. Highly disciplined and courageous warriors, the Ultramarines have remained true to the teachings of their Primarch Roboute Guilliman for 10,000 standard years. The Ultramarines were originally the 13th Space Marine Legion before the reforms that initiated the second founding and reshaped the Imperium after the heresy on the orders of Guilliman himself as the Lord Commander of the Imperium and Imperial Regent. The name Ultramarines is a nod to both the chapters standing amongst the other Space Marine chapters and their role as the source for the gene seed of more chapters of us. The task was gargantuan, and no mere mortal man could have faced it without going mad. Guilliman offered leadership and hope, and he became a figurehead for the reborn Imperium. Countless millions came to know his name, and while he could never replace their beloved Emperor, Guilliman was a firm hand when it was needed most, and the Imperium endured. In committing his wisdom to the first volumes of the Codex Astartes, Guilliman must have known that he would not see his most cherished ambitions fulfilled. After all, none had ever imagined that a Primarch might know death, but the heresy had seen several slain or otherwise lost, and in the years that followed more would suffer similar fates. When Guilliman was lost to the Imperium, he left behind him countless works of wisdom and insight, and the greatest of these was the Codex Astartes. Though the Imperium would again rise to heights rivaling those of the Great Crusade, and descend to depths of despair as dark as the Horus Heresy, Roboute Guilliman's wisdom would prevail. The Ultramarines were and are the guardians of that wisdom, and the exemplars of all their Primarch embodied. The Codex Astartes has become a holy text, a blueprint describing the ideals by which the majority of chapters organize themselves, fight, recruit, train and operate. The Ultramarines rule over a region of space called Ultramar, an autonomous realm that owes no tithes to the Imperium and looks entirely to its own defense. The peoples of the various worlds of Ultramar look to the Ultramarines as both beneficent rulers and as distant figures of legend. While the vast majority of humanity will never even see a Space Marine, let alone speak to one, the people of Ultramar are more familiar with these mighty warriors. Some even have the honor of being distantly related to one, perhaps some distant ancestor having been accepted into the chapter. The Ultramarines regard it as their sacred duty to rule their domains justly, and to protect them as the source of their recruiting and resources. In this, the Ultramarines are continuing the legacy of their Primarch, whose teachings each warrior studies and memorizes over the course of his service. The Codex Astartes is such a vast body of wisdom that even the prodigious, genetically enhanced mental capacity of a Space Marine is taxed with absorbing it all. Yet the Ultramarines regard it as their duty to do so, and choose to eschew the blunt tool of psycho-conditioning in favor of learning every passage by remorseless study. At the outset of the cataclysmic civil war created by the treachery of Horus and the machinations of the dark powers of the warp, the 13th Legion, the Ultramarines, stood as one of the single, most powerful military forces in the Imperium. With an active fighting strength somewhere in the region of 250,000 Legiones Astartes, a sector spanning domain under their overlordship and an arguably unparalleled structure for the supply and training of initiates, allowing it to withstand losses that would potentially cripple other legions, it was this very strength that would make it a prime target for the traitors' conspiracy. It would be at Calth that this blow would fall. But while the legend of the Lapis Blue hosts of Ultramar and the strategic genius of its Primarch Roboute Guilliman were already widely promulgated by the iterators and remembrancers of the Great Crusade, the path by which it arrived at this apotheosis of power was not so well known, and in some cases, the facts actively kept secret. Chapter color scheme is displayed by Primaris Marine Brother Galanus, an inceptor of the 7th Squad of the Ultramarines 3rd Company and Mark X Gravis Power Armor. The complexities of the Legion's past and the sometimes divisive and even antagonistic relationship the Ultramarines had with several of their fellow legions was also concealed. It would be this hidden history that was to bear bitter fruit on Calth and cast its shadow on the wars that were to follow. The Warborn. The 13th Legion's origin lay, as with their fellows, on Terra and the closing years of the Unification Wars. Extant records from this time show the 13th Legion's alpha intake, the test-bed raising of several thousand warriors by which its gene seed's stability and adaptability was judged, was passed firmly within acceptable parameters and with no singular or notable physical mutation beyond the expected pattern, with full functionality of implanted organs to projected specifications. Ultramarines Chapter color scheme is displayed by a firstborn Space Marine in Mark 7 Aquila power armor. Psycho-organically, initiates were noted to display increased aggression, as was expected, but also a marked tendency towards cohesion and the adoption of hierarchy, alongside an almost pathological dedication to the achievement of an assigned goal, particularly when compared against the psychological profiles of certain other alpha samples such as those of the 12 and 5 legions, later known as the World Eaters and White Scars, respectively, who demonstrated more markedly heightened individualistic and fractious tendencies post-implantation. Psycho-organically, initiates were noted to display increased aggression, as was expected, but also a marked tendency towards cohesion and the adoption of hierarchy, alongside an almost pathological dedication to the achievement of an assigned goal, particularly when compared against the psychological profiles of certain other alpha samples such as those of the 12 and 5 legions, later known as the World Eaters and White Scars, respectively, who demonstrated more markedly heightened individualistic and fractious tendencies post-implantation. Although much of what would then transpire for the 13th Legion's very early expansion past its test stage has been occluded by layers of the unbreachable secrecy inherent in much of the Emperor's gene work, and records lost in the destruction caused on Terra during the Great Siege. During the Siege of Terra, certain facts can still be pieced together and a hypothesis formed. Pre-Heresy Ultramarines Legion color scheme is displayed by a firstborn Legion Tactical Marine in Mark II Crusade power armor. In terms of recruitment, evidence is apparent for a net being cast across Terra for initiates for the 13th, with intake from areas as diverse as the sub-equatorial Maglev clans of Panpakro, the war families of the Saragon Enclave, the proud Mid-Afric Hive oligarchy and, most latterly, the anthropophagic tribes of the Caucasus Wastes. As varied in culture and origin as these groups were, they all had one factor in common: their violent and often bitter resistance to the later stages of unification, a resistance broken ultimately in each case not by negotiated surrender but near annihilation, with, in some situations, little remaining save interned refugees and orphan populations left by the savage conflicts which had brought these peoples to heel. It was this which led to the first informal cognomen by which the 13th Legion was known by the forces alongside which they served, the Warborn. It may then be theorized that the particular psychological effects of the 13th Legion's gene seed may have been used deliberately as a final weapon of the unification to bleed away potential rebellion on Terra, and also further absorb the strength of the savage tribes of Old Night into the fledgling Imperium. Further evidence for this can be perhaps inferred by the fact that no evidence remains of the 13th Legion seeing active deployment on Terra itself during the Unification Wars' bitter dregs, as both the 7 and 8 Legions, later known as the Imperial Fists and Night Lords, early incarnations were, for example, with their first full battle honors recorded as being for the first pacification of Luna, and the brutal Sedna campaign at the edge of the Sol system. As the earliest phase of the Great Crusade, the liberation of the Segmentum Solar, progressed, it was discovered that this ancient and most heavily settled region of the first stellar domains of humanity held many survivors from the Dark Age of technology. Of these there were some who openly welcomed the Imperium as patron and protector, but there were also many worlds who resisted imperial compliance, either through ignorance or prideful assurance in their own strength, just as there were others who were enslaved under the yoke of Xenon's oppression. The tide of conquest, however, with the Emperor at the head of the war effort, quickly gained rapid momentum, and the fledgling Space Marine legions undergoing their first great expansion were a key part of this. During this period the 13th, then around 8,000 Astartes strong, began to make its mark by taking part alongside other legions under the Emperor's direct generalship, gaining renown in notable campaigns such as the liberation of Diurnus and the destruction of the Scorvidian Xeno Empire, as well as amassing a string of successful compliance actions in solo operations on planets such as Lorne Sigma, Sekel's Landing and Nadebel. From each of these conquered human worlds, the most militant factions provided additional intakes of recruits tithed for the 13th, much as the war-born Sons of Terra had infused their first intake. It was during this early period of the Great Crusade that the genius of the Emperor's grand design for his Space Marine legions became increasingly apparent. While each of his transhuman cadres proved itself able to fight on any battlefield and achieve victory, The Emperor had clearly patterned in the alchemical mix of his sons a diversity of tempers and abilities that had given each legion a strength or suitability to a theater of war of its own beyond that of its peers. In some cases these talents were atavistic and visible, be they the near preternatural fury already being displayed by the 9th Legion, Blood Angels, or the uncanny resilience of the 14th Legion, Death Guard. In others they were subtle and bred in the bone, such as the oppressive darkness which consumed the souls of the 8th, Night Lords, and they could manifest in word and deed to the ruin of their foes, or the unyielding, cold passion and technological aptitude of what was already becoming known as the Iron 10th, Iron Hands. It was into this latter category which the 13th Legion fell. Legion's resolve and their arts of war was yet to come, however. In them was found a mixture of aggression and restraint, discipline and determination which rendered them supremely suited for joint task force operations and cross-theater warfare. The Legion also gained significant success in independence operations where it took direct command of secondary support forces of the Imperialis Auxilia, whether the professional and elite regiments of the Solar Auxilia and the regiments of the Old 100, or the often resentful and fractious hosts of Imperialist militia auxiliary recently forced into Imperial compliance. In the latter case, the 13th Legion often detached cadres of its own warriors to act as provosts and disciplinarians if needed, handing out final justice to the recalcitrant and inspiring bravery from the front lines, duties at which many other legions balked at as beneath their honor or as a poor use of Legionis Astartes in battle. In their adaptability and range of operations, they were said to be reminiscent of the vaunted Legion, Dark Angels, and the prominent Luna Wolves. The key to their fighting style was imitation and adaptation. Their own arts of war had evolved quickly from the tenets laid out during their indoctrination and training, becoming combined with influences drawn from the host of martial cultures from which they were founded and the other legions alongside which they served, from the knife craft of the Opaki gangs of Hive Corps to the armored warfare tactics of the X-Legion. By the third solar decade of the Great Crusade, the 13th Legion had begun to develop a distinct character of their own. They were recorded as having a practical and forthright mien, with little time given to the esoteric arts of warfare or conjectural strategizing, preferring a direct approach of swift engagement. In warfare, they relied upon the rapid attainment of quickly defined tactical objectives and strategies born of tried and tested battlefield experience and determined by the situation at hand. They also had their pride, and while they were recorded as being unwaveringly loyal to the Imperium's cause, they developed a tendency to guard their honor well and engaged in an open rivalry of achievement with the other legions alongside which they served, particularly those few whose Primarchs had already been recovered. The warrior brotherhood of the 13th Legion had also begun to display its achievement visually. But rather than take on a particular livery and iconography as a whole as the 3rd Legion, Emperor's Children, or the 14th Legion, at that time still the Dusk Raiders, had, individual companies who had come to prominence in a particularly important compliance operation or campaign took on additions to their core Legion livery, which maintained the post-unification storm grey and gunmetal they had worn since Sedna, to commemorate their greatest achievements. Those companies who had fought alongside the 8th Legion in the purgation of the abhuman corsairs of the Canceri Nebula afterwards bore black gauntlets, midnight blue helms and the ancient weighing scales and Death's Head icon of judgment and heraldic opposition of their legion numeral, and took the name of Nemesis as their own. Conversely, the principally armored formations of the 13th Legion who had halted the Orc advance on the ash plains of Cypermundi, and in doing so had saved a city of millions from a savage death, afterwards commemorated the battle by mirroring on their right pauldron the emerald light of the blazing armor borealis that had riven the skies under which they had fought. Such honors were claimed as the Legion's strength made visible, but for them no formal name for the Legion as a whole was desired save for its number, as their First Lord Commander Gran Basoto is recorded to have said, "I am told that once the numeral 13th was taken as an ill omen by the weak-minded and those enslaved by the lies of superstition, but in the Emperor's service we shall make it a byword for redemption and glory." The Osiris Rebellion. By the year 833 M30, the 13th Legion had increased in number to an active force of around 33,000 Space Marines, whose primary battle group now consisted of the autonomous 12th Expeditionary Fleet. This expansion of their number in a relatively short space of time had been due to two principal factors. The first was that their particular practical style of warfare had a tendency to avoid casualties where possible compared to the tactics employed by certain other legions. The 13th Legion avoided battles of attrition and prided themselves on achieving strategic goals with the minimum expenditure of life, and where salvageable human worlds were involved, this desire was also extended to the minimization of collateral damage. The second was a laterally revealed aspect of their gene seed. While the rates of gene seed implantation success for the 13th Legion zygote type were very close to the median level, it had proved to be in the highest resistance band to errors during extensive replication, a meridian matched only by the I Legion's own core sample, suffering relatively little mutation or deviation in the subsequent generation of harvested Astartes organs. This allowed the Legion to steadily expand its numbers, even without the stabilization brought by a Primarch's own mature gene code. At this time, the Emperor, in command of the might of the Principia Imperialis Expeditionary Fleet, Ferrus Manus and his ex-Legion and Horse and his Lunar Wolves, respectively, led the three main thrusts of the Great Crusade. They were pushing on into the outer void far beyond the segmentum solar. But such was the size, self-sufficiency and genetic stability of the 13th Legion that the 12th Expeditionary Fleet alone was entrusted with the task of exploring the extent of the intergalactic disk and its densely packed star systems coreward of Terra. This was why when a secession crisis unexpectedly flared up close to the Capitoline systems of the segmentum solar itself, the 13th Legion was the closest available legion and the swiftest to respond. The Osiris cluster, a grouping of 11 star systems making up the inner portion of the segmentum solar's second quadrant, had suddenly and without warning declared secession from the Imperium. Chartist merchant vessels had been seized, Imperialis Armada naval patrol squadrons fired upon and driven off by system defense ships, and agents of Imperial authority rendered silent and assumed dead. The inhabited worlds of the Osiris cluster, many technologically advanced at contact, had originally come into compliance during the Great Crusade's 8th standard year in relatively bloodless order. It had been viewed as a highly successful campaign in which the 13th Legion itself had a hand. That the Osiris cluster had now fallen into open rebellion was deemed an affront to the Legion's honor by its Lord Commander, Grand Vasoto, and the Legion Master of the 13th Legion had vowed to bring the matter to a resolution as swiftly and emphatically as possible. Vasoto, acting on initial intelligence reports, ordered the warships of the 12th Expeditionary Fleet to proceed directly to the Halo world of Septus 12, leaving behind the fleet's support elements, lumbering transports and forged ships guarded by its slower combat vessels. The target of this rapid strike force was to be the atmospherically sealed city of Cabasset, located on the night side of Septus 12, and the economic and political capital of the Osiris cluster. A strike there before the rebels had time to consolidate their forces, Vasoto reasoned, might end the rebellion in a single, bloody stroke. Breaking into real space in the outer system, the power of the 12th Expeditionary Fleet's 2 score of capital warships, led by the Legion's flagship, the Goliath-class macro battleship Cephalon's Thunder, easily swept aside the system defense monitors and fireships sent out to intercept them. Immediately after the short firefight, in which the Space Marine ships sustained no losses, they engaged in a brief and equally successful long-range precision bombardment to defang Septus 13's orbital defenses, before moving to attack the planet itself. Vasoto had formulated a plan of attack based around a decapitation assault against the governmental and environmental control complexes on which all life in the Hive City was dependent for survival. The strategy was a variation of a tried and proven tactic in part developed from close observation of the Lunar Wolf's mastery of such attack forms, and which promised a quick resolution with the minimum of damage to the Hive world's infrastructure and an object lesson in the futility of rebellion. The plan itself was predicated on detailed prior knowledge of the world as an imperial holding and a military assessment of the potential numbers and capabilities of the rebellious militia forces the Legion was projected to encounter. Unfortunately, every assumption Vasoto and his command staff had made about what awaited the Legion was wrong. The attack on Septus 12. The attack began well enough, with the close support fire of the Cephalon's Thunder opening up great rents in Hive Cabasset's protective outer shell into which Vasoto personally led his Legion's Stormbirds to the attack. Resistance was immediately far heavier than expected as the landing force became swiftly bogged down in human waves made up of at first hundreds and soon thousands of dead-eyed civilians crudely stitched into makeshift pressure suits and armed with improvised weapons of every sort, not least among them explosive mining charges converted to suicide devices. The 13th Legion quickly modified their tactics to inflict maximum attrition but, heedless of casualties, the tide of bodies pressed on in cold silence and it was quickly apparent that this was no mere rebellion and no ordinary enemy. Unwilling to allow his attack to be stalled and his invasion force surrounded, Vossotto called down reinforcements and ordered his attacking squads to press on, relying on speed and coordination, as well as the superiority of his Space Marines in close quarters, to carry the battle. Slowly and with steadily growing losses, the Legiones Astartes forced their way deeper into the Hive City and one by one began to claim their tactical objectives, crushing better armed but equally vacant-minded opposition formed of what had once clearly been the bodyguard cadres of the Hive City's nobility. But once the 13th Legion was heavily committed and kilometers deep into the Hive, the trap was sprung. A Xenos fleet of unknown type and origin, comprising 5 vast hourglass-shaped vessels whose structures turned and rotated ceaselessly like clockworks, appeared with great speed from within the fiery corona of Septus' giant star. Realizing the disaster that was about to unfold, Vossotto called a general retreat from the surface, but as his forces battled to return to their gunships and transports, the assault on the Space Marines intensified as the nature of the attacks began to change. While the waiting Stormbirds fell under concerted all-out attack in an attempt to cripple or destroy them, fresh mobs of grasping civilians poured from side junctures and corridors, their intention not to kill but to overwhelm and pinion individual Legiones Astartes, drowning them in their massive bodies, heedless of the cost of life. Above them in the void, the two fleets clashed. The great hourglass craft, each easily outmassing the gargantuan Cephalon's thunder, lashed out with blazing whips of elemental particles, scorching and burning the Imperial warships and engulfing any fighter squadrons or torpedo salvos that came close in collapsing gravitational singularities, annihilating them utterly. The 12th Expeditionary Fleet was overmatched but fought on valiantly, causing one of the Titanic Xenos craft to fall back, strangely colored vapors bleeding luminously from its rent hull, but at the cost of a dozen of its own number, while the Cephalon's thunder, at that point a burning wreck, tumbled out of control through the line of battle. It was then that fearful figures, aglow from within with sickly light, began to materialize among the attackers both on the surface and directly onto the warring Imperial vessels. Armored in some form of Baroque biomechanical containment suits, the creatures within were barely corporal, ghoulish shapes of glowing mists whose gauntlets spat ethereal fire and whose alien wills reached out to crush the minds of those who resisted them. Vossotto's final command was for the fleet to withdraw with as many of the 13th Legion as could be recovered, but withdraw it must. A new enemy of the Imperium had been met, and word of it must reach Terra at any cost. Vossotto committed his life to the command of the rear guard on the surface, as penance for his error, and his last act was to transfer Legion command to the most senior surviving commander present in orbit, First Master Marius Gage. It was a testament to Gage's swift thinking and tactical acumen that he was able to hold off the enemy vessels until every surviving Stormbird from the ground assault had departed the planet, fighting a swirling three-dimensional battle of thrust, counter-thrust and retreat which held the enemy Titan ships at bay until the 12th Expeditionary Fleet had fought its way clear. Ultimately, what could have been a disaster had been fought into a mere defeat, and when all was afterwards measured, the 13th Legion had suffered a little over 6,500 Space Marines lost, the largest tally of any single battle in the Legion's history. Although this was approximately a fifth of its fighting strength in terms of Astartes, the lost counted among them much of the elite of the Legion, many of them Terran veterans from its founding and its Lord Commander Grand Vossotto with them. Its fleet had also suffered heavily, with a quarter of its warships lost or irrevocably damaged, not least of all its flagship. Just as bitter a blow was to the Legion's pride and honor at the defeat to which their overconfidence had led them. They hungered for vengeance, but even this was denied them. When the 13th Legion returned to the now quarantined and blockaded Osiris cluster a little under a standard year later, it was with a force heavily augmented from the Solar Armada, elements of the 18th Legion, Salamanders, and specialist anti-psyker cadres from Terra. Of the enemy xenoforms the officiobiologists had designated Osiris hybrid, there was no sign. Instead, the Imperials found worlds either left as wastelands of the unburied dead or locked in turmoil and civil strife. Piecing together fragmentary records from planetary dataspheres and human minds alike all but purged clean, it was impossible to know from where the Xenos had come or where they had gone, only that they had operated covertly at first, insidiously claiming worlds outright, burning out the wills of their populations, stealing away some bodily into the void, and leaving the others to simply mindlessly perish by starvation or inaction in their absence. Other worlds they had sent first into rebellion and then strife through covert psychic domination of their rulers and manipulation of their population's fears. The revelation was of a foe perhaps not numerous, but both insidious and frighteningly powerful, a clear threat now marked for extermination by the Emperor's own writ. In the wake of the short campaign, empty of glory, which brought the remains of the Osiris cluster back into the Imperium's control for repopulation, the 13th Legion swore a blood oath of vengeance against the Xenos wherever and whenever they might appear again. The Legion, now under Marius Gage's stewardship, reorganized and sought to quickly replenish its numbers and supplies, and afterwards redoubled its effort in the Great Crusade service, as if trying with each fresh victory to prove that the defeat at Septus had been an aberration never to be repeated, and the name of its lost master and indeed the battle in which he fell became a thing no longer spoken of but which dwelled as a shadow at their shoulders. There existed within the Legion now a brooding sense of loss and a canker of doubt in its own abilities, and in the hearts of its legionaries grew the desire, always present but now lent keen impetus, to reunite with their Primarch as a balm to all their ills, to become, as they saw it, whole. The dark irony was that more than 2 Terran years previously, unknown and withheld from the Legion's knowledge and before the events at Septus, their Primarch had been located by the Emperor, but owing to the vagaries of the warp, contact would not prove possible for several more standard years. During this period, brief as it was and yet seeming an eternity to the sons of the 13th, the Legion fought on with a relentless but joyless hunger for battle, taking world after world for the Great Crusade in rapid succession, but shunning now both the laurels of victory it once courted and the respect of its peers it once craved, until the hour of its salvation came at last.